As Pastor Kathleen mentioned, this weekend we're doing our annual Disney show. It's the 8th year that we've done it, and we added a show yesterday. Last year we just did 2, and it was just a spectacular program, and for me it is so fun to see so many folks who come who maybe don't have connection here, and their children come and they just light up, and it's delightful. But the reason for me saying that is that Ryan Mack, who just slid out there, is filling in for us today because all the vocalists are taking the day off because they're singing so much. However, I do want to say that Ryan is playing all the shows, and he's still here. Our whole tech team is still here, and Pastor Kathleen and I are still here. So we just want you to know that some of us have the resilience here to be with you this morning and to do the service with you. But then again, those singers are singing a lot, and we want to make sure that their voices are fresh for the shows this afternoon. Little boy ran out of Sunday school class really excited, and all the way home was telling his mom and dad about the story he had just heard. It was a story about how God took some dust and breathed life into that dust, and it became a human being by the name of Adam. And then God put Adam to sleep, and he pulled a rib out of his side, and he created a woman. He created a wife for Adam named Eve, and he just thought that was absolutely amazing. So that night, as he was getting ready for bed, he looked under his bed, and he saw a bunch of dust mites under there. And he yelled down, he said, "Mom, I think a man is growing under my bed." And a couple days later, she went into his room. It was morning, and she was trying to get him ready for school, and she could tell something wasn't right. He was laying in bed. He looked feverish. He was groaning. He was holding his side. He said, "Mom, I think I'm having a wife." 40 years ago today, it was a Friday night. Jan and I stood in front of all of our family and friends in Richfield, Minnesota, Hope Presbyterian Church. And that's a picture of my grandfather there. And of course, Jan and me. And we shared our vows with each other, and we became husband and wife. And because 40 years is a pretty significant anniversary, and I know there are many of you who've been married a whole lot longer than that here, and because we're doing this series on Christianity 101, I thought this is a really good time to bring these two topics together and ask the question, what does God say about marriage? As Pastor Kathleen mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people who have a lot to say about marriage today. There are a lot of books out there about marriage, and increasingly there are people who are trying to tell us that marriage is obsolete, that marriage can actually be bad for us. So it's a good time to talk a little bit about this important relationship that God has created for human beings called marriage. And there are a lot of different things that we could look at, a lot of different passages from Scripture that we could focus on, because God is really for marriage. God is really bullish on marriage because God created marriage. And he created it at the beginning of creation of human beings as one way for human beings to experience a close relationship together. So there could be a lot of passages, but I decided that we would focus today on the one passage that's probably quoted more than any other when it comes to marriage, and that's from Ephesians chapter 5. It says this: "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." Now, men, does that give you goosebumps when you hear that? If you're married men and your wife is here, just turn to her and say, "I love that verse." Just to take a moment, do that. Wives, do you get tears in your eyes when you hear that verse? If your husband is here or your spouse is here, just turn next to that person and say, "I want to live out that verse. That's biblical." You want to? No? Men, I'm guessing if you felt anything, it was fear. And you're thinking, "Tim, don't go there. Please don't go there today." And women, if you had tears, it's anger. Because unfortunately, far too often, far too many pastors have begun their sermon and ended their sermon with that verse. And because of it, that word, submit, is probably the most misinterpreted, misunderstood, misapplied, and abused words in the entire Bible. And it's really a shame. Because I think Paul used that verse for a reason. That Paul used that verse to say something compelling to us and profound about marriage, but more than that, something profound about God. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the Bible, and when you're reading the Bible, it's always important you get context. You can't just pick out a verse here or there. You got to get the context. So here's the context for that verse. Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. It's not just a one-way street. This is a two-way street. Submit to one another. And then Paul says, for wives, this means submit to your husbands out of reverence for the Lord. And for husbands, this means love your wife as Christ loves the church and gave himself up for her. See, Paul uses this word for a reason, because for Paul, the word submit is not a law word or a demand word. It is a grace word. It is not a passive word. It is an active word. It is not something that is imposed on us. It is a gift that we give. It is not something that debases us or demotivates us or humiliates us. It is a word of power that enables us to express love to our spouse. Because for Paul, to submit is to love the way that Christ loves us. So what I want to do is use that word submit, because it's a word that gets our attention today, right? If I just said, okay, we're going to talk about loving our spouses, we say, yeah, we've already heard about that. When I say let's submit to our spouses, now I've got your attention. So I'm going to use that word submit, and we're going to give it a biblical facelift. And we're going to use submit as an acrostic to tease out some of the things that God is saying about marriage and some things that we can do to build a great marriage. So the S in submit stands for spontaneity. Now, every great marriage is built on routine and ritual. And that's really important. It's important for marriages to get into a groove, to know how to relate to each other. Ritual and spontaneity is like putting on that favorite sweater or those old shoes, and as soon as you get them on, you just know this is right. This feels good. However, ritual and routine can get boring if we're not careful, and that's why we need spontaneity. We need some surprises once in a while. It's spontaneity that puts a spark into marriage. It's spontaneity that breathes some fresh air into that marriage. There was a husband who was sitting on the bed one day. He was admiring his wife, and she was looking in the mirror, and he could tell she was thinking something. So he said, "What are you thinking?" And she wistfully said, "Oh, to be ate again." And instantly the creative juices went off in his mind. It was his anniversary the next week, and he had no idea what to do for it, but now suddenly he had the whole day planned. And so the next week on their anniversary day, he woke his wife up, he brought her into the kitchen, and he had made her pancakes in the shape of little animals. And he smothered it with not ketchup, with syrup and little sprinkles. And then he took her to the zoo, and they enjoyed all the different animals, and they went on rides, but no adult rides. They went on all the kiddie rides. And they ate cotton candy, and they stuffed themselves with hot dogs, and then they went to see a Disney cartoon, which we now call animated features. And they just had a great day together. And they got home, and they collapsed on the couch. They were exhausted. And his wife leaned over, and she grabbed his hand. She said, "That was the best anniversary ever." And he said, "So how did it feel to be ate again?" And her eyes grew wide as saucers, and everything clicked, and she said, "I was talking about my dress size." Spontaneity adds spice to life. And to so submit is to love by being spontaneous. The U stands for understanding. Your spouse is a mixture, an incredible mixture of biology and personality traits and family history and cultural shaping and love language and talents and passions. And one of the great joys, one of the great adventures of being married, especially for a long time, is really getting to know each other. To understand what makes your spouse tick, to understand what makes your spouse do the things that he or she does, what motivates your spouse. And that understanding is a lifelong process, in part because we're always changing as human beings, but in part because it just takes a lifetime to really get to know that person we're committed to. And to submit is to love by learning to understand your spouse. The B stands for bonding. When God created Adam and Eve at the beginning of time, at the end of chapter 2 of Genesis, the writer says something really profound. He says, "And then the man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. The phrase one flesh means to be bonded together, to be knitted together or soldered together. And so to bond means that we just do things together. And we do things together in the 21st century without the phone. Maybe you saw this in the Republic. Arizona had the highest average daily screen time of 276 minutes. This is in the entire country. More than twice the 131-minute average of the lowest state, Oklahoma. Weekly, Arizona spends an average of 32.2 hours on their phones. That's roughly 12 hours more than the national average. Annually, Arizonans average nearly 70 days using their smartphones. Now, that's a lot of bonding time. Imagine what you could do with 70 extra days in your marriage. The things you could see, the things that you could do, the experiences that you could build together. And so bonding is really about doing stuff and doing stuff that you like to do. Whether it's hiking or going for walks or going on trips, checking out different restaurants, visiting museums. And for those of you women who are married to a man, here's something that's really interesting about a man's brain. A man's verbal centers in his brain, for most men, are triggered when they do something. Men find it much harder to be verbal when they're sitting and doing nothing, and much easier to verbalize when they are moving and actively doing things. So if you want great conversation with your husband, get out and do stuff, and you may find that he's more talkative. Now, I can't guarantee that, but brain science says it's pretty likely. So we submit to each other when we love each other by bonding together. The M is for mending. Husband and wife had a really bad fight. And it got to the point where they weren't speaking to each other. And neither one was about to budge. Neither was going to be the first to speak. And so they ended the day by writing notes to each other. So right before they went to bed, the husband wrote a note to his wife and said, "Wake me up at 5 o'clock. I have a plane to catch." He woke up at 9. And as he was getting out of bed to go chew out his wife, he found a little note on the bedstand. "It's 5 o'clock. Wake up." That is not the way to mend a relationship. Probably every couple here who's ever been married heard the advice, never go to bed angry. And that is great advice, even if you have to be up 3 nights in a row. Never go to bed angry. Forgiveness is the Elmer's glue of relationships. To submit means that we are forgiving people, that we will forgive freely in the relationship, and we will ask for forgiveness freely. It is forgiveness that mends the hurt, that mends the brokenness, that puts the pieces back together. The I stands for intentionality. A woman went to see her counselor because she'd had it with her marriage. She was ready to get a divorce. And she was talking to the counselor, and she said, I can't stand this guy anymore. I don't love him anymore. Here's our problem. We don't have the finances at this point for us to live in separate places, so we have to try to figure out how to get along with each other until the divorce goes through. Any advice? And he said, yeah, here's something I'd like you to try. I want you to go home and just act as if you love your husband. Do the things that you would do for him as you did when you loved him. Talk to him the way that you did when you loved him. Just act as if you love your husband, and hopefully that will bring the temperature down in the room a little bit. So she came back a month later, and he said, all right, so should we start talking about the divorce? And she said, divorce? I'm not getting divorced. I found out I really love that man. Marriage is certainly about love. It's about a feeling. But marriage can't be built only on a feeling. Marriage is built on intentionality. It is built on a love that acts, that does the things necessary to keep the relationship alive. And then finally, the T is for trust. The hallmarks of any great marriage is to completely trust the other person and to be completely trustworthy. To be able to build a relationship where you can be honest with each other, where you can be vulnerable, where you can share your heart and your soul and know that it's safe because you love each other and you can trust each other. To submit is to love. To love is to submit. When we love, when we submit, we build spontaneity into our marriage. We learn to understand each other. We take the time to bond and to mend that relationship, to be intentional, and to trust each other. And the reason why Paul uses this word is because that's the picture of the love that Jesus has for you and for me. Jesus is one who expresses his love for us by submitting himself to us. He's always coming to us with spontaneous forgiveness. He understands everything about us, everything, down to the number of hairs on our head or lack thereof. He bonds with us through his death and resurrection. He mends us with his unconditional forgiveness. He's always intentional. His grace is intentional. It is for you, and it is a grace that loves you. And he's someone who can always be trusted. Paul says it this way in the book of Philippians. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. That's the same word for submit. Emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, again submitted himself, and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. To submit is to love your spouse as Christ loves you. So for those of you here today who are mourning the loss of the love of your life, may God's grace fill you with the joy of good memories. For those of you who are having a hard time right now trying to keep your marriage afloat, may God give you the grace to make wise decisions. For those of you who have experienced the heartache and the trauma of divorce, may God give you the grace to heal. For those of you who are experiencing thriving marriages, may God continue to grace you with happiness and love. For those of you children here who may get married someday, may God's grace even now begin to prepare you and your future spouse for a lifetime of adventure. And for all of you, married or single, may the one who submitted himself to the cross for you fill you with his grace. Amen.